Hi, welcome to what we are calling Classic Bookmark. When we started shooting these interviews in the spring of 1988, we had no idea the show would go on for 30 years, with over 400 episodes. To celebrate and mark this achievement, we have selected 15 shows. Choosing was difficult. Most of the writers chosen, like Horton Foote and Ray Bradbury, are deceased. Others, like Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize winner, are perfectly well, but I do not think we will be lucky enough to have them on the show again. We purposely did not include some bookmark favorites like Rick Bragg, Winston Groom, Sina Jeter Naslund, Brad Watson, Daniel Wallace, Michelle Richmond, and others, since we plan to visit with them regularly in the future. Viewers will notice that the technology has improved considerably in 30 years. We've cleaned these up the best we could. These first 30 years have been a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy watching these as much as I did making them. William Styron was raised in Southern Virginia, and even as a child was fascinated by the stories he heard of the great slave rebellion of Nat Turner. The Confessions of Nat Turner was not his first book, but it was a book he knew he would have to write. Nat Turner won for Styron the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1968. 12 years later, Sophie's Choice, his fictional treatment of the Holocaust, won the National Book Award. I spoke with Styron at his home in Connecticut. The Confessions of Nat Turner was published more than 35 years ago, and at the time there was a great uproar, great controversy. Now, a lot of time has passed, and I'm curious about whether, from this vantage point, with this passage of time, why was there such a fuss? Why was there such a controversy? And, what have you been thinking about it since then?
Well, the uproar came because of a very strange conjunction of historical facts or factors. The book was begun in the early 60s when Martin Luther King was making his famous conciliatory statements about integration and so on. And the book was finished at the very height of the Black Power movement, the Black Panther movement, the urge toward vengeance on the part of, and some of it quite justified on the part of the black intellectual community. And I think what happened was it was intolerable that a white man at this critical moment came out with a spectacularly successful, as it was indeed, bestseller. It stayed on the bestseller list for months and was #1 bestseller and that sort of thing. And it caught the attention of vast numbers of Americans. And it purported to be the book purported to be a examination of this major slave revolt in American history. And I think it was intolerable to many black intellectuals that once again, a white person at this moment was not only attempting to interpret black history, but indeed was doing it in the most with great the effrontery of it, adopting the persona of a black person. In this case, Nat Turner, a black figure. So I think this was the troublesome fact of the whole matter.
Well, that was some 35 years ago. What if the Confessions of Nat Turner were published now? What do you think the response would be now?
I think there would be a truly measurable difference. I think that if I had published the identical book in the year 2002, I think the response would be entirely different. I don't think there would be there might be some carping criticism, and that might be justifiable, but I don't think that the book would have been, would be rejected in the same kind of fierce way it was rejected in 1968.
Can you say why you think this is the case.
I think it's because at the moment, if the book were published now, without the surrounding ambience of almost hysteric rage involving whites and blacks, there would be an accommodation. There would be an understanding that the book was not intended to be a historical tract, but a novel, and that a novel was written by a white man who had the right and the prerogative to do what I did 30-some years ago.
Let's change direction slightly. Several places over the years you've expressed your opinion of book reviewers, book critics, and college professors. And it's not always been very kind. What do you think has gone wrong in the establishment that receives literature and comments on it?
I may have overstated my case about reviewers and critics and academics and so on. I think, as a matter of fact, there is a fairly high level of intelligence involved now in criticism, and that I think possibly I could say that, like most writers, I have been hypersensitive to criticism. I do feel that quite legitimately I could complain about having received more than my share of what I consider to be totally unfair criticism, including especially Nat Turner. And so that therefore my complaints are legitimate. But in general, I think that there's a fairly high level of critical intelligence at work in America today. And a friend of mine, Irwin Shaw, the late Irwin Shaw, always said we remember the bad reviews, we never remember the good reviews. And there's some accuracy about that.
Well, right now in America, if you were to direct a person to read good book reviewing and literary criticism, where would you send them?
Well, I think you just mentioned probably the best source, although I'm talking about the New York Review of Books. It tends to be sometimes very specialized and a bit opaque, but in general it covers a very important segment of the literary and intellectual scene in America, and I would recommend that first. I think the New Yorker does not nearly as good a job as it once did. For instance, its emphasis on long book reviews is much less than it was 10 or 15 years ago, but still you can get a fairly good take. The New York Times book review, I think, is often just mediocre, and I don't recommend it very highly, and it's getting less and less authoritative as time goes on. So there are a couple of examples. I would add to those the Harper's and Atlantic, I think, are both responsible publications that often do a good job of reviewing.
Well, in theater reviewing, a critic or two can make or break a play.
Well, I think that was especially true a number of years ago during the notorious reign of Frank Rich as chief theater critic of the New York Times, when it was an amazing period when he could just make or break a play, and did, by his either negative or positive reviews. Some of that has simmered down, I believe. I don't believe that the Times any longer has that total authority to be able to make or break a play. So I don't think that autonomous quality that Frank Rich had is any longer apposite.
Do you think that maybe the New York Times Sunday Book Review is in that position now?
I don't really know if I were a publisher, I'd be able to tell you better, more accurately. I'm not really sure what kind of power the New York Times Book Review has. I gather that once again, its voice is one of nearly absolute authority in certain circles, and that a well-placed review in the New York Times, which is highly favorable, can do a great deal to make a book soar. And conversely, I think a bad review can do the opposite. So therefore, I think it does still have great authority.
Well, over the years, almost all of your novels have been very favorably reviewed. The one exception might be the reception of Set This House on Fire.
The book has a lot of flaws, I would readily admit, but I don't think it deserved the kind of limbo that it's been cast into. Curiously enough, in France, it was a huge success and still widely read in France, which is an indication of a cultural difference, if nothing else. I think the book probably does deserve a bit more attention than it's received.
Why do you think sometimes the French appreciate American writers more than American audiences do? I mean, they've loved Poe, Faulkner, Styron.
I don't think that it's a totally unbalanced thing. I think what the French have had the knack of doing is to receive a writer's impact early in his career. I mean, Faulkner was virtually out of print in this country when the French were discovering him. And this is true for a number of other writers.
In interviews over the years, in interviews after the publication of The Confessions of Nat Turner, and in interviews after the publication of Sophie's Choice, you have answered the question, what is the nature of evil in mankind? And a couple of times you've changed your mind. At one point you thought it was perhaps cultural or sociological. At another point, psychological. From this vantage point, what do you think it is now?
Well, I've always felt that if I had to paraphrase my attitude toward evil, it would probably resolve itself into an inquiry into what it is that causes human beings to zealously try to dominate each other. What is it? To me, one of the definitions of evil is when the need to dominate our fellow human beings goes berserk and results in violence and immoral behavior of an extreme sort. And this is, I think, the link between Nat Turner and Sophie's Choice. Both have to do with absolute manifestations of evil, as a form of enslavement and extermination. And this to me is the ultimate inquiry. It's what we're faced right now with the terrorism that surrounds us. And it's a matter of exceptional interest to me for that very reason.
Let me pursue that just a little bit further. Where do you think evil comes from? Is it cultural or is it a metaphysical problem?
I think it's both. I think it's a mystery. Because, as a species, we're capable of enormous good. We're capable of compassion and love, friendship, benevolence, philanthropy. And that makes it all the more ironic and horrible that as a species we're equally capable of this runaway need to dominate and to destroy one another. And it's been my ill-fated attempt to make that inquiry, to try and find out what makes this thing happen. I don't think I've been successful, although I do believe at some points I've tried to give some informed hints as to why this is possible in the human race.
I'd like to change directions a little bit and talk about two writers that are important to you. The first one is Fitzgerald, who, by all accounts, is your favorite writer. What is it about F. Scott Fitzgerald?
Well, I think Fitzgerald had a kind of purity of style. Someone said, when we read a writer, often we want to find out what goes on in the writer's soul. I mean, that's an interesting definition of why we read a certain writer. And I think there was something going on in Fitzgerald's soul that was immensely lyrical and beautiful, and that we sensed that when reading this man. we sense it in the kind of purity of his style, the kind of gracefulness, the kind of elegiac nature of his vision of life, which corresponds to the poet that he admired the most, namely John Keats. And I think that's it. It's this ineffable kind of shimmering beauty in his very writing that I think appeals to us.
I'd like to give you an opportunity just for a minute to talk about your good friend, James Jones. There's a writer, I think, a first-class writer who isn't very well known and isn't very widely read. Say some kind words about your friend Jim Jones.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, I'm not sure if he's entirely neglected. I think he does have a readership of sorts that is respectable. I think that his major works, namely From Here to Eternity and The Thin Red Line, are amazing works. They're remarkable, almost the purely authentic and authoritative descriptions of American fighting men at a certain period in our history. And I think as such they'll remain immortal. I think that no better chronicle of the sheer brutality of the infantry fighting in the Pacific has ever been written better than in The Thin Red Line. And as a result, I think Jim's will always have a readership of sorts out there because of that keen ability to capture the soul of the fighting man.
In the late 1960s and up through the 70s, the literary movement that we now call post-modernism or fabulism or metafiction held full sway, was in charge of American letters. But it's gone now. What do you think happened?
I sensed, I think, I may be wrong, but I think I sensed in those writers a kind of arch, kind of academic formalism, absence of true emotion. I think literature has to have, I don't mean gush emotion, but I think one of the qualities of great literature is the creation of character. Foremost, almost supremely so, that we remember works of enduring literature, not always, but more often than not, through the creation of people. And I found that period of writing in which you were describing was academic tricks in which there's, to the best of my knowledge, not a single memorable human being was created. And I still believe that's true. I think you can comb through the works of William Gass and Donald Barthelme and others in that category and search in vain for a truly memorable human being. And I think that's one of the reasons I felt negative about that kind of writing.
Well, I don't want you to recant, but would you make an exception for John Barth?
I would, yes. John Barth is of that group is certainly the one that has, I think, the most legitimate claim to lasting writing.
Recently, I was reading the stories in A Tidewater Morning, especially the story about the young Marine lieutenant, and I made the most amateurish error. It just seemed to me this had to be straight autobiography, and of course, I was wrong. You did not go ashore where E.B. Sledge did go and fight in the Battle of Okinawa.
Yeah, well, I came very close to being in on the invasion of Okinawa, and as a matter of fact, as a young Marine lieutenant, and I was just projecting in that episode what it must have been like had I indeed not been retarded, set back, and been still ashore on Saipan, and instead had indeed been in on that invasion, and so that was a fantasy on my part.
Do you know the Sledge book?
I know the Sledge book very well, and I think it's one of the great chronicles of infantryman's experience ever written. It's a marvelous book.
Do you think that book is on a par with James Jones's book of combat, The Thin Red Line?
I would put the two together as exemplary works of World War II fiction and some of the best writing ever done about the infantry experience.
I'd like to hear you say something about the use of autobiography in your fiction generally, like in Sophie's Choice. Stingo is you, worked at McGraw-Hill, rejected Kon-Tiki, and then it isn't you. Sophie was a real person you met, and then isn't that person. It's very confusing for readers.
Well, I don't think it's a big mystery for me. It's just, I've always felt that since most fiction is essentially, to some degree at least, autobiographical, we put our characters into the works we write, that it's perfectly fair game for me to be writing pure autobiography and then letting it merge with fiction, with fantasy. And I see no contradiction in that activity.
Well, of course, you have published a small volume of memoir, Darkness Visible, about a very specific space of time in your life. Are you thinking in terms of perhaps a larger memoir, a full autobiography?
Not necessarily. I feel when I wrote Darkness Visible, I really wanted to dispense once and for all with my own experience with this hideous disease of depression, clinical depression. I wanted to get it firmly off my chest. And I wrote it at a white heat. I wrote it very rapidly and got it off my chest. And I don't think I want to return to that scene again. It was too painful, but I'm glad it was done.
Well, not that period of your life again. Not to revisit that period, but a whole memoir, an autobiography of your whole life.
I have the hankering to do some truly autobiographical writing in the purest sense, which is to say, long memoir. I know that memoirs are currently being reviled, but I still think that they can be fine, legitimate ways to open up one's own experience and describe it.
Well, is that the book that is on the yellow legal pad right now?
Yeah, I would say it is, yes.
In almost every book, maybe in every book you've ever written, some part of the action takes place in your home place, in Tidewater, Virginia. Why is it that you return again and again to that particular locale?
Well, I think one returns very naturally to one's roots and origins. It's the area where you find the most poignant experience, I think. Your childhood, your boyhood, your early youth, all that's redolent and reeking with stuff to write about. And it's our fountainhead, our source. And so that's why I go back to it. If I'd been born in Seattle, I'd probably do the same thing for Seattle. But it happened to be Tidewater, Virginia, and it happened to have especially appealing quality, I think, physically, that watery sort of atmosphere, the tidal streams, the rivers, the beaches, that distinctly southern quality that part of Virginia has was very meaningful and poignant to me.
Well, that part of Virginia, that part of America had a lot of black citizens. If you'd been raised in Seattle, there would not be this William Styron.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I think there's a certain additional impact that one must concede that enters one's writing when it is involved with this tragic bifurcation of experience that comes from living in a segregated society as I did. There's no doubt about that. It was a horrendous time, and I think that people should remember that segregation inflicted dual wounds, not only on black people, but the people who were the victimizers, namely the white people. I know that I suffered moral wounds from living in that society, and I think that possibly the writing of of Confessions of Nat Turner was an attempt to exorcise that demon.
Would you say that maybe the essay This Quiet Dust was a piece of retrospective exorcism after the Confessions of Nat Turner?
Yeah, I think so. I was trying to get that out of my system too.
Well, as time has passed, who in your generation of writers do you think is going to last? Who do you admire? And also, of younger, newer writers, who has come to your attention? Who do you like?
Well, I think I have a whole galaxy of contemporaries who I think are shining examples of enduring writers. I think I would say John Updike, Philip Roth, Cormac McCarthy, Norman Mailer. There are four right there who have done wonderful work. I don't know if I'm totally capable of talking about the younger generation. I think you mentioned earlier Richard Yates, and I think that he was a writer who's being rediscovered justifiably because he's a wonderful writer. He's roughly the same generation as mine. He died, as you well know. As for the younger writers, I did read this remarkable book by Jonathan Franzen, and I liked it a lot, The Corrections. I don't really read too many of my younger contemporaries, but that's one I liked a lot.
It is something of a commonplace for people as they get older, maybe especially men, to read more nonfiction and less fiction.
I still read fiction when I've been touted onto a novel or short stories. I think that they can still be very rewarding.
Thank you very much. This has really been fun, and it's been very kind of you to let us come into your house and conduct this conversation.